In 1883, a Smithsonian crew walked up to a 33-foot mound in West Virginia and started digging into something the Shawnee had refused to touch for generations. 13 skeletons came out of that hill, but the one that mattered lay at the very bottom. 10 bodies ringed it in a perfect wheel, every pair of feet pointing inward toward the figure at the center. That figure was taller than any man on the crew, and its skull wasn't shaped like a human skull. And within a lifetime, every one of those bones had disappeared. There's a stretch of West Virginia where the Kanawha River bends, and the land starts keeping its own counsel. The roads around here quit using names the way roads do in flatter country, and the maps go vague right where the valleys get deep. People who've lived in these hollows a long time talk about the silence the way they talk about the weather, like it's something you plan your day around. It isn't the empty kind of quiet. It's the full kind. The kind that feels like a room where someone just stopped talking and never started again, and the wind coming down off the ridges carries it from one hollow to the next like a thing with weight. Right where the river makes that slow bend, the earth rises in a smooth, silent cone, 33 feet straight up and 173 feet across at the base. From a distance, it looks too even to be natural, like somebody set it there on purpose and walked off without explaining. And somebody did. The mound was built by hand, basket load by basket load of dirt, roughly 2,000 years ago, by the people archaeologists called the Adena. They lived across the Ohio Valley and the hills around it long before any European name got attached to any of this ground, and they buried their honored dead in these great conical hills, sending them off with copper and mica and the things a person might need on the other side. The Adena didn't just pile dirt. They ran trade networks that pulled copper and mica in from hundreds of miles away, materials that had to be carried overland to end up on the shoulders of their dead. They built log tombs inside the mounds, laid ash floors, wrapped bodies in bark, and shaped the skulls of their children into forms the rest of the world wouldn't recognize. Their mounds dotted the Ohio Valley and the Kanawha, and the Creel was one of the grandest of them, which is exactly why nobody left it alone. Forever. By 1840, locals had already leveled the top of the cone to put up a judge's stand, because they ran horse races around the base of the mound and wanted a place to watch from. The hill had been sacred for 2,000 years, and it took the new arrivals about a generation to start running horses around it. It's the second largest burial mound in West Virginia. Only the Grave Creek Mound up in Moundsville is bigger, and that one carries its own legends. This one, the Creel Mound, sat between two enormous circular earthworks, each one better than 550 feet across, like a pair of wide-open eyes staring up at the sky. The whole arrangement was deliberate. Whoever planned it had more in mind than stacking dirt. They were building something meant to be seen from a distance and remembered for a long time, and for most of the years since, it worked. For most of that time, nobody touched it. The Shawnee came into the Kanawha Valley much later, centuries after the Adena were gone, and they treated mounds like this the way you treat something that doesn't belong to you. You leave it be. A little way downriver there's even a place people still call the Shawnee Reservation Mound, rebuilt in Institute, West Virginia, as a reminder that this was Shawnee country. The Shawnee didn't build these hills, though. They were the ones who refused to open them. And that difference matters more than it sounds, because it tells you who thought the mound was safe to crack and who didn't. So you've got a 2,000-year-old earthen cone standing between two sacred circles, watched over by a people who came after and chose to leave it sealed. And then you've got the year 1883, when men from Washington arrived with shovels and measuring tapes and a list of questions they meant to settle by cutting straight into the heart of the thing. The central question was simple enough on the surface. They wanted to know who was buried in the base of that hill, and why the people who came later refused to disturb them. What the Shawnee wouldn't touch, the Smithsonian intended to open. The men who showed up that year didn't come looking for treasure. They came looking for answers to a fight that had been splitting American intellectual life for decades. The question was whether the great earthen mounds scattered across the eastern half of the country had been built by the ancestors of the native people still living there, or by some vanished, superior race that had died out long before. A lot of powerful people preferred the second answer because it let them tell themselves the land had been empty before they arrived. The Smithsonian's Bureau of Ethnology wanted the truth on the record, and they put Cyrus Thomas in charge of finding it. The argument had real teeth at the time. Books were written about a lost race of mound builders, pale-skinned and advanced, supposedly wiped out by the ancestors of the very people the government was busy removing from their land. If the mounds were theirs, the story of an empty continent waiting to be settled got easier to tell. Thomas's job was to dig through the romance and find the dirt, and the dirt, mound after mound, kept pointing the same way. The bureau he worked for had been set up in 1879, inside the Smithsonian, under John Wesley Powell, the one-armed explorer who'd lost his right arm at Shiloh, and then run the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon anyway, with a hunger to map everything the government didn't yet understand about the continent's first peoples. Powell wanted the mound question answered with shovels and paper, not opinions, and he handed Thomas a budget and a mandate to open as many mounds as it took. Over the next several years, Thomas's teams dug into mound after mound across the eastern states and wrote it all up in the kind of dry, thick reports that Washington is good at producing and almost nobody reads. The Creel Mound was a small piece of one of the largest archaeological surveys the country had ever attempted. Thomas was a professor, methodical and skeptical, exactly the kind of person you send when you want a messy question settled with paper and measurements instead of rumors. He'd spend years on it, and he'd eventually conclude what the Shawnee already knew, that the mounds were built by native hands. But to get there, he had to open them, one after another, and write down what was inside. The Creel Mound, sometimes called the South Charleston Mound, was one of the biggest and best preserved on his list, so it got some of his most careful attention. He wasn't working alone, and he wasn't working small. The dig ran under the supervision of Colonel P.W. Norris, and the operation covered far more than a single hill. Across roughly 8 miles of river terraces around present-day Charleston, Thomas would eventually catalog 50 separate mounds, some as short as 3 feet and some better than 35, along with 8 or 10 great circular enclosures that fenced in anywhere from 1 to 30 acres. The Kanawha Valley held the second largest concentration of these earthworks known anywhere. Opening the Creel Mound meant opening the heart of the whole complex. Picture the scene the way the records led us. A West Virginia summer, the air thick off the river, and a crew of men in stiff, sweat-stained canvas hacking into a hill that the locals had been walking around for generations. There were no helicopters, no ground-penetrating radar, no modern preservation chemistry. There were shovels, notebooks, measuring tapes, and whatever discipline the Bureau could enforce from Washington. They dug the way the 1880s dug, which is to say they were thorough about writing things down and rough on the things they pulled out of the ground. And that last part is worth holding on to, because it's going to matter later. These were credentialed men, government men, the kind whose notes get archived and whose word carried institutional weight. When they wrote down what they found at the bottom of the Creel Mound, they weren't treasure hunters spinning a yarn for a newspaper. They were scientists making an official record, which makes what they recorded and what later happened to it a lot harder to wave off. They started at the top and worked their way down, and the first thing they found was almost nothing. 2 skeletons turned up near the upper part of the mound, shallow and scattered, the kind of burials that might have been added late by people who didn't want to dig very far. The crew noted them and kept going, because the real burial, the one that made the hill worth building in the first place, was never going to be near the top. It was going to be at the bottom, where the mound met the original ground, sealed under thousands of basket loads of earth and 2,000 years of silence. As they got lower, the shape of what they were digging into started to change. Down at the base, the dirt gave way to something deliberate. Holes in the old ground surface showed where posts had once stood, the outlines of a wooden vault, a log tomb built to hold the dead before the mound was piled on top of them. Whoever was buried here hadn't just been laid in the dirt. They'd been housed. The floor of that tomb was laid with white ashen bark, and the bodies inside had been wrapped in elm bark before they were placed, like people being put away carefully for a very long trip. Then came the part that doesn't leave you once you've read it. At the base, inside that tomb, lay 11 skeletons. 10 of them were arranged in a ring around one figure at the center, and every one of those 10 had been laid down with their feet pointing inward, toward the middle, like spokes on a wheel. Think about what that takes. You don't bury 10 people in a perfect circle, all aimed at one body, by accident. Someone planned this. Someone decided that these 10, whoever they were, would spend eternity aimed at the one in the middle, and then they built a 33-foot hill over the whole arrangement to make sure it held. The 10 around the edge came with their own goods, arrowheads and lance heads, fragments of shell and pottery, the ordinary kit of people being sent off with the things they'd used. But the figure at the center got something different. Laid near its head were a fish dart, a lance head, and a sheet of hammered native copper, the kind of metal that had to be traded in from far away and worked by hand. Copper wasn't decoration to these people. It was weight and meaning, the kind of thing you put with someone who mattered in a way the others didn't. Whoever sat in the middle of that wheel was what the whole arrangement was built around, and the height was the least of it. Think about the labor of it, too. A log tomb at the base of a 33-foot mound means someone felled trees, hauled them to a river bend, fit them into a chamber, lined the floor with ashen bark, wrapped 11 bodies in elm bark, arranged 10 of them in a ring aimed at the 11th, laid copper on the one in the middle, and then covered the whole thing with tens of thousands of basketloads of earth, one at a time, until the hill stood taller than a 3-story building. Calling it a burial undersells it. This was a construction project, and the man at the center of it was the blueprint. You build a hill like that over one person because that one person, in life, carried a weight the rest of the community couldn't hold on their own. And that's the geometry that hangs in your head after the measurements fade. A towering figure at the center of a log tomb, wrapped in bark, laid on white ash, crowned with copper, ringed by 10 people all pointing their feet at him like a compass rose. What they'd cut into was a statement carved out of dirt and timber and 2,000 years of silence, and the men from the Smithsonian were the first people in all that time to read it. The only question left was who or what the statement was about. The crew did what crews like that did. They measured the figure at the center before the damp and the air could finish it off. One of the men helping Colonel Norris, A.R. Signs, laid the bones out and ran a tape from the crown of the skull down to the heel. The number he wrote down was 6 feet, 8 3/4 inches, a little over 2 meters, end to end. That's not 9 feet. It's not 8. But it's a good deal taller than most of the men holding the tape. And for a skeleton badly decayed after 2 millennia in a sealed log tomb, it was enough to stop the room and make everyone look twice. Picture the room when the tape came out. A badly decayed skeleton, 2,000 years in the ground, the bones soft and dark with moisture, laid out on a canvas or a plank while a man who'd helped dig it up crouched with a steel rule and called the number to whoever was keeping the notes. There's no photograph of the moment, and there's no photograph of the skeleton either, because in 1883 field photography was clumsy and expensive, and the crew was busy. What survived was the measurement, the description of a once most powerful man, and the spoke of feet around him. Everything else, the smell of the open tomb, the weight of the copper, the way the skull sat in the dirt, died with the men who were there. That's the thing about the Criel dig. It's the best documented giant in West Virginia history, and it still leaves you reading between the lines of a government report. The official record even hedged the number. The National Park Service nomination form, written long after the dig, added a quiet line suggesting the extreme height might have been an exaggeration, created by the earth pressing down on the burial over the centuries, flattening and spreading the bones as the mound settled. In other words, the skeleton may have measured longer in the ground than it had stood in life. That's the careful, scientific version, the one in the archives, and it's the version you'd cite if you wanted to shut the whole story down. The valley told a different version. As the dig became local lore, the details swelled. The reports people passed around described a giant 7.5 feet tall, wearing 6 heavy copper bracelets on each wrist, with 3 large plates of mica laid across his shoulder like armor. Another skeleton from the same stretch of digging was said to have a flat head-type skull, the kind of skull that doesn't look like it belongs on a person from around here. The Bureau of Ethnology's own annual report got pulled into the retelling until the line between what was measured and what was remembered started to blur. And that gap between the 6'8" in the record and the copper-armored giant in the telling is where this whole story actually lives. The Smithsonian version gives you a tall man in a log tomb, pressed long by time, surrounded by 10 people and some copper. The legend version gives you something closer to a king, a towering figure dressed in metal and stone, set above the rest on purpose, the kind of burial you only build for someone who doesn't fit the ordinary scale of a human life. Neither version is the whole truth, and neither one is just a story. The 9-foot skeleton from the title belongs to that same fog. The Creel giant wasn't measured at 9 feet, and saying so would be lying about a tape measure. But 9-foot skeletons, and taller, do show up in the West Virginia record, in other mounds, in other decades, reported by other people who also wrote down what they saw. So when the title promises you a giant, it isn't making the Creel figure into something he wasn't. It's pointing at a pattern, a whole chorus of mounds across the state giving up the same impossible measurements. And the Creel dig is just the one with the cleanest paperwork. Those other mounds are coming. First, though, there's the matter of the skull. Up to now, the question has been how tall. And from here, the question gets harder, because height is something you can measure with a tape and move on. Shape is something you have to look at, and looking at it is what unsettled the diggers most. The Creel finds included a skull the records called the flathead type, a skull that didn't rise and round the way a human skull is supposed to. And the Creel dig wasn't alone in this. Over in Wheeling, crews opened up another group of these large skeletons, ranging from 6'7" to 7'6" in height, and every one of them came with unusual skull formations, low foreheads and prominent occipital regions, the backs of the heads jutting out where they should have curved in. To a man raised on European anatomy, raised to think a human skull had one basic shape, these didn't read as human. They read as wrong, as animal, as something that shouldn't have been wearing a person's teeth. That's where the shouldn't have been human in the title actually comes from. The bones came from people whose heads had been reshaped on purpose, into forms the diggers had never seen and didn't have a frame for, not from another species at all. Here's what was actually going on, and it's stranger than a monster. The Adena and the peoples around them practiced cranial deformation. They bound the heads of infants while the bones were still soft, wrapping and pressing them so the skull grew into an elongated or flattened shape that a person carried for life. It was deliberate, and it was cultural. A reshaped head marked you as belonging to a people, or a rank, or a tradition that ran back longer than anyone could count. Whole generations grew up, lived, fought, and were buried with skulls that didn't look like ours, because their families had decided, before they could walk, that the human head was something you were allowed to remake. So the non-human skull wasn't non-human at all. It was deeply human, so human that someone had taken the trouble to sculpt it by hand, the way you'd sculpt clay, into a shape that meant something to everyone who saw it. The diggers misread it as a monster because they'd lost the key to what they were looking at. They were staring at the remains of a whole people who had agreed, generation after generation, that the ordinary shape of a head wasn't good enough, and that the people who mattered should be reshaped into something the world doesn't make on its own. And the practice wasn't random. Anthropologists who studied the Adena and their neighbors found that the reshaping followed patterns. Certain forms marked certain lineages or certain standing, so that when you saw a person's head you knew, before they spoke, something about who they were and where they fit. It was a language written in bone, carried on the body for a lifetime, and then carried into the mound after death. The diggers in 1883 couldn't read that language because the people who wrote it had been gone for 2,000 years and hadn't left a dictionary. So they did what anyone does when they find writing they can't translate. They called it monstrous, and they moved on to the next mound and the skulls kept coming out wrong, and nobody quite knew what to do with a people who had turned their own heads into monuments. That reframing doesn't shrink the mystery, it deepens it. A race of 9-foot monsters is a creature feature, here one century and gone the next. A culture that bound its children's skulls into alien forms and buried its tallest dead in copper-crowned wheels is something harder to shake, because it's people. doing things people do, on a scale and with a patience that doesn't fit the story we like to tell about who was here first. And the Creel Mound wasn't the only one giving up bodies like this. Far from it. Pull back from the Criel Mound for a second and look at the state around it, because West Virginia has been giving up skeletons like this for nearly 200 years, and the Creel dig is only the cleanest chapter in a much longer book. The accounts come from different decades, different counties, different kinds of diggers, and they keep describing the same thing: bones that are too big, in places that are too old, handled by people who didn't know what to do with them once they were out of the ground. Some of these were surely stretched by the telling. Some were probably misidentified. A tall man turned into a giant by a loose tape measure and an excited reporter. But when the same impossible number turns up across 185 years and a dozen counties, the pattern is the point, even if any single skeleton isn't. The earliest one anyone wrote down came in 1774, before West Virginia was even a state. A settler named Jack Parsons was walking the bank of the Cheat River after a flood and saw bones sticking out of the washed-out earth. He pulled a femur free, held it against his own leg, and found it was 7 inches longer. He dug out the rest and laid it out, and the skeleton, by his estimate, would have stood about 8 feet tall. The settlers started calling the place Giant Town, the way people name a place after the thing they found there that they couldn't explain. In 1838, amateurs broke into the Grave Creek Mound up at Moundsville, the biggest one in the state, and came out saying they'd found giant skeletons inside, some up to 8 feet long. In the 1850s, a crew digging a root cellar in Palatine, near East Fairmont, uncovered 2 large skeletons, both said to be better than 7 feet, and several people saw them before nightfall. By the next morning the bones were gone, stolen in the dark, almost certainly sold into the lucrative trade in Indian relics that was running hot at the time. In 1857, the Western Literary Messenger printed a story about a skeleton turned up in East Wheeling that the sheriff and another man measured at 10 feet 9 inches, with jaws and teeth, they said, almost as large as those of a horse. The bones on display at the sheriff's office for anyone who wanted to look. The reports keep coming. In 1875, workers building a bridge at the mouth of Paw Paw Creek in Rivesville dug up 3 giant skeletons with strands of reddish hair still clinging to the skulls. And a local doctor examined them, judged them human, and put their height near 8 feet, right before the bones crumbled away in the open air. In 1882, an amateur named F.M. Fetty and his wife were poking around a rock formation along White Day Creek in Marion County, found a false wall, pulled the stones away, and discovered a huge ancient mummy sitting upright in a chair, ringed with stone and flint artifacts. The next summer, 1883, a fellow named James Faulkner dug up another giant skeleton in the same area, and a doctor named Samuel Kramer from Smithtown measured it at 7 feet 4 inches, guessing the living person had been nearly 8 feet tall. Sit with the Fetty find for a second, because this one breaks the mold. A false wall, hidden behind stones, in a rock shelter along a creek, and behind it a huge body seated upright in a chair, surrounded by tools, as though someone had been propped up to keep watch over the valley long after they were dead. A giant propped upright in a chair is a vigil, not a burial, and it suggests the people who put him there wanted him to stay where he was, doing something, not just lying in the dark. The Creel dead were laid flat in a wheel. The Fetty dead were sat up to watch. Different mounds, different centuries maybe, an impossible scale all over again, and the same silence afterward about who any of them were. Even into the next century the pattern held, and the Sutton dig is the one that lands closest to the 9-foot promise in the title. In June of 1930, the Clarksburg Sunday Exponent reported on a professor named Ernest Sutton, head of the geography department at Salem College, who'd excavated 2 mounds 12 miles west of Salem in Doddridge County and pulled out 4 skeletons. The paper said the tribe was believed to have stood 7 to 9 feet tall, thought to be Siouan, and the best preserved skeleton, sealed in a clay encasement, measured around 7 feet 6. Sutton was a professor, not a newspaperman, working with students behind him, so even the careful academic version of that dig gives you 7.5 feet, while the version the paper printed ran all the way to 9. The gap between the clay-sealed 7-6 and the headline 9 is the same gap as the one at Creel, the gap between the number on the tape and the number the story wanted. That gap is where West Virginia keeps its giants. And as late as 1959, a curator named Dr. Donald Dragoo from the Carnegie Museum opened the Criel Mound in Marshall County and unearthed a skeleton that stood 7 feet 2 inches. That's 1774 to 1959, Cheat River to Marshall County, floods and root cellars and bridge footings and college professors and museum curators, all describing the same thing. You can write off any one of them. Writing off all of them is harder. But notice the shape of every single one of these stories, because it's the part nobody talks about until the end. Every account, from Giant Town to the Criel Mound, finishes the same way. The bones come out of the ground, somebody measures them, and then the bones are gone, crumbled or stolen or shipped off, until there's nothing left to look at. Every one of them ends in an empty hand. So that's the second half of the pattern, the half the title doesn't tell you. Giant skeletons kept coming out of West Virginia mounds, and then they kept vanishing once they did, until you're left with a spoke pattern of bones that no one can produce a single fragment of today. The Creel skeletons, the ones with the cleanest paperwork of any of them, aren't on display anywhere. You can walk to Staunton Park in South Charleston and stand on top of the mound they came out of, and you won't find a museum case holding the tall man from the center of the wheel. The hill is still there, the bones aren't. The reasons aren't mysterious, but they're worth saying out loud, because the absence is real and it needs explaining. The first reason is the air itself. When a sealed mound chamber is cracked open after 2,000 years, the things inside have been resting in a still, damp, low-oxygen pocket that kept them from rotting. The moment you let the outside in, the decay catches up fast. The Reevesville skeletons in 1875 are the queerest example. The doctor had them in front of him, judged them human, estimated 8 feet, and then watched the bones deteriorate rapidly as they sat exposed. Ancient bone is fragile, and air eats it. A lot of what was found simply fell apart in the days after it was uncovered, before anyone could preserve it, because in the 1880s almost nobody knew how. The second reason is greed. There was a lively market in Indian relics in the 19th century, collectors and dealers paying for skulls and artifacts, and a giant skeleton was worth more than a regular one. The Palatine skeletons in the 1850s were seen by several people in the afternoon and gone by the next morning, stolen in the dark and almost certainly sold. When bones are valuable and unguarded and sitting in a hole in the ground in the middle of nowhere, they don't stay put. Some of the missing giants didn't crumble. They were carried off and sold to someone who didn't leave a receipt. The third reason is the one that feeds the legend, and it's the most boring of the three. Specimens got shipped east. Bones and artifacts from digs like the Creel excavation were sent to the Smithsonian and other institutions, cataloged in the loose way of the time, moved from collection to collection, and over 130 years a lot of them simply lost track of themselves. Some were reburied, some were discarded as duplicates, some are probably sitting in a drawer under a number nobody's looked at in 100 years. The record of what was found survived. The things themselves drifted apart. There's also a fourth thread, quieter than the other three, and it's the one that haunts this whole story. A lot of the digging in the 19th century was done by amateurs and curious locals, not museums. And what those people found often stayed in a barn or a parlor or a doctor's office until the family died out or moved on, at which point the bones just left with the house. No record, no receipt, no crate number. A femur measured at 7 inches too long could end up propping open a screen door for a generation, and then in a burn barrel the next. The official digs, the ones with paperwork, are the minority. Most of what came out of the West Virginia dirt came out through hands that never wrote anything down, and when those hands let go, the trail went cold. None of that is proof of a cover-up. It's proof of how badly 19th century field archaeology preserved what it pulled out of the ground, and how time and money finished the job that the air started. But it's also exactly the kind of hole a story rushes in to fill. You take a recorded giant, a copper-crowned skeleton in a wheel, and then you take the fact that no one can show you a single bone from him today, and the gap between those two facts is wide enough to drive a whole mythology through. The bones are gone for ordinary reasons. But gone is gone, and gone is what a legend needs to grow. So let's take the cover-up question head-on, because it's the one that brought a lot of you here. The story you've heard goes something like this. The Smithsonian Institution dug up hundreds of giant skeletons from Native American mounds across the country, realized they didn't fit the accepted story of who built the mounds and who walked this land first, and quietly made them disappear, burying the evidence in basements and denying it ever existed. It's a story told in books and forums and late-night videos, and in the hollows of West Virginia it's told like it's settled history, because the mountains love a secret, and they love even more a secret someone in Washington is trying to keep. The mainstream record reads it differently. The standard view is that the giant skeletons reported across the United States through the early 20th century were a mix of hoaxes, scams, honest misidentifications, and the bones of extinct animals mistaken for human. Skeptics point out that no verified giant skeleton sits in any collection anywhere, and that the cover-up story has never produced a smoking gun, no leaked memo, no whistleblower, no crate of 9-foot bones pulled out of a Smithsonian basement. From that side of the fence, the whole thing is a 19th century newspaper habit that grew into a modern myth, and the giants were never there to cover up in the first place. Here's the honest middle, and it's where this channel tries to stand. You don't need a conspiracy to explain bones that crumbled in the air, were stolen for the relic trade, and were lost in a century of careless cataloging. Those ordinary causes are enough, and they're documented. But you also can't pretend nothing strange was ever recorded, because the spoke pattern, the central giant, the copper and the deformed skulls are all sitting right there in the actual Bureau of Ethnology report, written down by government scientists with measuring tapes. Both things are true at once. The cover-up is unproven, and the bones are genuinely, verifiably gone. The absence is real even if the conspiracy isn't. And there's a third option that both sides tend to miss, which is that the truth got lost in plain sight, not hidden on purpose. The 1880s were a bad time to be a fragile bone, and a worse time to be a fragile bone that someone wanted future generations to study. The science of preservation was barely born, the relic market was hungry, the record-keeping was loose, and the country was busy erasing the very peoples whose ancestors were in those mounds. You don't need a locked basement to lose a skeleton. You need a damp room, a careless clerk, and 100 years of nobody asking. The conspiracy assumes someone cared enough to hide the giants. The sadder truth is that mostly, nobody cared enough to keep them. And that's the reframe that matters. The cover-up story survives not because someone proved it, but because the silence it's built on is real. When every physical trace of a recorded giant disappears, and the only thing left is a line in an 1894 government report, people fill that gap with the biggest answer they can find, because a big silence feels like it needs a big explanation. The mountain didn't hide a conspiracy, it hid an absence. And an absence, to people who've grown up in these valleys listening to what the wind carries down off the ridges, feels exactly like a secret someone is keeping from you. The real mystery of the Creel Mound was never whether giants walked West Virginia. It's that something tall and strange and carefully buried was pulled out of the ground, written down by scientists, and then simply stopped existing, until the only evidence left is a hill that won't say a word. Today, the Creel Mound is the centerpiece of a small city park in South Charleston, on the National Register of Historic Places since 1970, 33 feet of silent earth over a wheel of bones that's now just a few lines in an 1894 report. The hill is still there, saying nothing. If you want more stories the mountains kept quiet, subscribe, and share this one with someone who needs to hear it.